Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here today. This is my second presentation of my 2-presentation series, and I'm so happy to have you here and that I'm able to share my story with you. So thank you for making it, and with that I will begin with my presentation. So this presentation is especially important to me because today the subject of my presentation, my father, is seated here in the very front. Sorry to put you on the spot, Dad, so shout out to my father. I'm going to be talking about him a lot. So here he is right here in the front seat. But as an introduction to my presentation, I would like to begin with a quick reflection. Why am I doing this research presentation? Before I go into what it is or what I did, why am I inspired to do this? And all of this starts with family. So up here on the screen is a photo of my father and I. Probably I was aged 2. And for my whole life, my father has perhaps been the most positive, happy person in my life. Along with my beautiful mother here, of course, Sophia, who also has very interesting history, but my father and I have always been very close. And for all of my life, I knew that I was part Amerasian, meaning I was part American, white American biologically, and also part Asian, which meant that my father was also Amerasian. But why was I Amerasian? Why was I mixed race? What was my cultural identity? At the age of 2, of course, I had yet to know this, but perhaps last year, I really began to ask these questions, and thus I embarked on my research journey. So last year, in the spring of my junior year, I had the opportunity to apply for a senior-directed project, which is essentially a free research block given by SSIS to seniors who are wishing to study an independent research project. And I was told that I could take courses on Coursera about history, about storytelling, but I wanted to go on my own journey. I wanted to research my family with materials that I would find about my personal people in my family, people who are of importance to me rather than taking an online course. So with that, today I will present to you all the different things that I did throughout my past summer. So of course this senior-directed project is a research block that happens within my senior year, so I currently have 1 block in my school to work on this. But this is the research that I decided to do from June of this year to August. So this is really my primary and secondary sourcing, and I'm so happy to share that with you today. So as a quick outline of my presentation, just so you're aware of what I'm presenting, firstly, I'll go into why research, diving deeper into my research questions and my different motivations. And then secondly, I'll go into how I did these things. How did I dive deep into my research? And how did I grow intellectually as a learner as a result? Lastly, I'll talk about the different things that I discovered about my family, which to me is the most exciting part, and it might be to you too, which is what is my family's story, and how will I tell it, and who will I tell it to? So with that, I will begin with part 1. Why research? What were my motivations? And to do that, I think I have to give you some context as of what I knew going into this presentation, or going into this research in the first place. And it all starts in the 1950s, which I knew for most of my life was that my grandmother, at the time a Chinese-Vietnamese woman living in District 5 in Vietnam, married a Chinese-Vietnamese man in the 1950s, but soon after, due to the Vietnam War and circumstances of United States involvement, she had an extramarital affair with an American man. So during this time, it was quite common for American government officials or people who were sent over, people pursuing business opportunities, to have relationships with Vietnamese women. And the one result of this was the birth of my father, who was born in 1972 in District 5. Now, during this period of time, you must understand that in 1975, when the war ended, economic circumstances were quite bad. People who were faced with these difficulties of having Amerasian children were frequently discriminated against and had poor financial circumstances, which led to my grandmother not being able to take full care of my father. And thus he was adopted by, wait, the drama continues, my grandmother's ex-husband, who is not biologically related to me, but out of the goodwill of his heart adopted my father into his family of 3 at the time, but now 4. So there were 3 children and my 1 grandfather who adopted my dad. And then one thing that I did know at the time was that in 1975 was the fall of Saigon. So my father was born in 72. The biological father left Vietnam before my father was born, so he never got to know his biological father. The fall of Saigon occurred, just for some historical context. And I knew that in 1984, my dad's family, and his new family of 4, fled for the United States by plane. And I put the Thai flag here because they did go to a refugee camp in Thailand for a little bit before reaching New York City, specifically the Bronx. So given all of these things that I knew, this was quite broad, I would say, compared to what I know right now. I knew quite shallow the details of my father's history, but not so much. So for all of my life leading up to last summer, I had these questions, which was, what was my dad's refugee story? Because we read right now, we have all these visiting authors that write about their boat people's stories, that write about their refugee stories, but I knew that my family had my own. So I wanted to know, what was my father's family story? So one of my other wonderings was, what government policies and events led to the sponsorship of Amerasian refugees like my father? What were the United States' motivation in this? What was happening in Vietnam during this time? And how does my family's picture fall into this? And lastly, I knew that my family's story was not the only one, and that there were many other refugee stories at the time that I wanted to find out about. So lastly, what are the other refugee stories that I could tell? And this leads me to part 2, which is the very exciting part, which is the process-oriented part of my presentation. How did I take on the process of answering all of these research questions that I had? And really, to break down this research process, I put it into 3 main parts. The first of which being secondary reading. So this is really a period when I was contextualizing history. And then I had period number 2, which was primary sourcing. And during this time, I focused more on family-specific primary sources. And Mr. Walton here knows, my AP US history teacher, that primary sourcing is really first-hand material. So I was looking at photographs, I was looking at recordings, I was conducting recordings and oral history interviews. And lastly, this is the part that I'm currently on, is the archiving and writing, creating the final products, if you will. After all of this secondary and primary research, I then put it all together. So this is what I'm currently doing, and this presentation, in fact, is a part of this last part of my process. So firstly, going into secondary sourcing. What is secondary sourcing and why is it important? When I was first introduced to this whole research experience, I was told that it's like a forest. You have to understand that studying history and studying refugee stories, or any stories for that reason, is like studying a forest. There's a forest of different stories out there. There's a forest of different interpretations. And yet my family history and my family story is only one little tree. So in order to understand my one little tree, I had to stand on the shoulders of historians to be able to see the entire forest and where my little tree was within that forest. So that leads me to my first reason of why secondary sourcing. The first reason is because I needed to contextualize my family history. So I was reading a lot about the Vietnam War, because keep in mind, prior to this project, I hadn't taken a Vietnam War course. Probably the extent of my knowledge was the Ken Burns documentary. Beyond that, I had read no books about the Vietnam War, and I didn't have too much of a knowledge because this wasn't just something that we talked about at home, because it did cause a lot of trauma for my family. So I needed to contextualize the war for myself. And the second reason of why primary sourcing, I like to call, is the art of storytelling and telling history. Now, why do I need to study methodology and knowing how to tell a story when all I'm doing is simply telling a story? Well, the thing is, telling stories is subjective, because the way that I interpret my family history might be different from the way my father interprets his family history, to the way my grandfather interprets his family history. So I had to approach it as a social science. As I researched the way that other historians and other authors approach history, I come up with the best way to interpret mine. Thus, methodology being the second reason for my secondary sourcing. So now, going into what I did to do all this secondary sourcing, these are some really exciting photos. Essentially, from July, all of July, pretty much this summer, I spent my time reading. I was reading in different university libraries, checking out books, setting up meetings with different librarians, creating a bibliography of different sources that would allow me to contextualize history and also come up with a proper methodology. So during this time, I have a sister who attends Boston College. If you know her, her name is Kelly. She's currently a junior at Boston College. She was kind enough to lend me her ID card and help me book different meetings with the librarians there. They actually have an East Asian librarian, which was really interesting because I was able to get really specified knowledge on those different sources that the Boston College library had. So in Boston College, I was really reading about what the Vietnam War was. What were the events that led to the Vietnam War? Who were the different countries involved in the Vietnam War? And I really distinctly remember this one book I checked out at Boston College, and I would sit there in the library and just be marveled at all of the history in front of me that I had yet to discover. So this is really contextualizing. And I also had the opportunity to read at Columbia University, where I was able to get really detailed sources on specific refugee contextualization. So what did I discover from my secondary sourcing? The first of which, contextualizing overall general Vietnamese history. When the war ended in 1975, the people of Vietnam faced extreme economic hardship. And we know this through the 1 million dong VND bills that we have right now. There was mass inflation. Everyone who had money essentially had nothing. The people who were able to escape by boat were those who had gold, or those who knew how to trade, or those that had connections that were able to leave. But for those who had to stay, life was rough. And it was specifically rough for the Chinese-Vietnamese communities in Vietnam in 1975. So I write that there were the Chinese Hoa who live in District 5, as you know right now, which is where my father's family originates from. And lastly, we have the people who are leaving. We have the boat people. We read lots of stories about the 1 million refugees who had to flee by boat. But keep in mind, once again, these are the people who could afford it. So what about those who were left behind? In my opinion, the most unfortunate circumstance of which is the Amerasian children, because they had faces of the enemy. They look like the people who caused all of this, or were a factor in all of this economic depression that led to the hardships that Vietnamese people had to face. They were a constant reminder, both physically and through their presence and through their spirit, that Vietnam had a lingering history in this brutal war. And my father, in fact, was one of these people. These two photos right here are of my father. And the United States knew about this discrimination that was happening. They knew that children were beat in schools because of the look on their faces. And so in 1982, the United States employed the Amerasian, or American Immigration Act, which essentially recognized Amerasian people by just their physical features and gave them immigration status to return to the United States, or just to immigrate to the United States. And this was followed by another whole series of different acts, but for my family, I really studied the 1982 immigration because my father left in 1984. So these were some of the things that I was really digging deep into in Boston College and in Columbia, was understanding the history and the different policies that allowed my family to leave. So now that I was done with the secondary sourcing, I moved on to the primary sourcing, which in my opinion is the most fun part. I love reading, I love everything, but getting my hands dirty on the real primary materials was the best. Because in this one phase, I was really going to firsthand, or secondhand, understand my family's immigration to the United States through their eyes. Now, I'm lucky enough that today I have family members who are alive and healthy who allow me to experience these stories. I interview family members, and I knew that if I don't do this now, I may never have the opportunity to hear it from their perspective. So the first thing that I did was, after I came back from the United States in July, remember I spent my first month reading in different university libraries in the States, I came back and I went straight into it. I spent a lot of time at the Vietnam National Archives. Who I'm partnered with here is Thư Nguyen, who is a graduate student from Fulbright University in Vietnam, the one by Crescent Mall. They're an amazing institution who has allowed me to work in the Vietnam National Archives. Now, in the Vietnam National Archives, essentially this archive contains materials from the First Republic of Vietnam, so the southern government before 1975. So I was really able to understand the first-hand experiences of all the different refugee groups in the United States and in Vietnam. Sorry, I mean only in Vietnam. And one group that I really fell in love with, which is not super relevant to my father's story, were the Bac Di Cư in Vietnamese, or otherwise known as the 1954 to 1955 emigrants due to the Geneva Conference. Now, I'll answer this in Q&A if you have any questions about the 1954 immigrants, but it's a little off topic from my father's history, but this was something that I really discovered in the Vietnam National Archives. Now, moving on to family primary sources. All of this time, so my morning routine was that in the morning I would go to the Vietnam National Archives, I would research, I would translate, I would read, and then in the afternoon I would sit in my dad's room, he would have a glass of wine, and I would interview him. So we would go on for hours and I would ask him all these questions about his past. I dug up all these different photos from my family that luckily my dad had kept from way long ago, and I asked him questions about each photo that I could find. And with every interview and with every different album that I could find, I eventually built a family archive of photos. So one thing that was really important for me was that I was able to really restore this history and make sure that it was protected. And in doing so, I created an archive of, I would say, 300 photos that I deemed were pretty important, put them all in a spreadsheet, asked my dad about all of them, wrote down descriptions. So this was really special for me. because I knew that my family was being recorded and it was being documented. So we had family photos, we had different oral histories with different family members, all leading me to understand my family from their perspective. And this is the story that I would like to share with you now, was what was my dad's story? What did I learn through all of these different hours of interviews and these 300 photos that I found and all the spreadsheets that I have? And perhaps this will be very intriguing to you. So these are perhaps some of the most important family sources that I like to look at time to time, and all three of which I found from different family members who told me about the immigration to the United States. Now, essentially, in order to apply to be able to immigrate to the US, they had to give documentation to prove that my father was Amerasian. So these two here were put together, and at the top of this document you can see ref interview with a whole barcode number on it. And these are the only two laminated documents that I have in my collection. And why were they laminated? Why is there a reference number? Is because these were photos that my grandfather had to submit in order for them to get permission. So I'll read you this article. It essentially says, this picture here is the only one left in a souvenir album of my family. I respectfully request for your full assistance under my case of having a half-breed child, son, would soon be approved in order that myself, my half-breed adopted son, and my two children could be soon authorized to emigrate to the US. With thanks, Mac Min. This letter, which was the back of the wedding photo that I showed earlier, along with different photos of my dad, a seemingly half-Western-looking child, was what they had to do to prove that my father was an Amerasian. What I learned during my secondary sourcing and also in my primary sourcing were that Amerasians were being taken advantage of during this time period. In my primary sourcing, I discovered from my dad that he was once tried to be sold to a Singaporean family so that they would have the documentation and the proof that they had an Amerasian child with them. So in order to validate my dad's existence as a half-American child, this is what my grandfather had to do. So once they wrote all the papers, once they were granted immigration status, how did they afford the flight to go to the US? Now this is when this document comes into play. At the top right corner here, you can see that it says the Pearl S. Buck Foundation, and it has an attorney's name on it. The Pearl S. Buck Foundation was a humanitarian aid organization, an NGO, who was sponsoring people who needed humanitarian aid from war-torn countries, specifically Vietnam in this case. So in this document is a whole 3-4-paged letter written by my grandfather that was later translated that had all the information about my father and his American biological father's identity. Once this was sent to the foundation then approved his request to be immigrated, and they paired him with a sponsor family in the US, and they were granted, and the sponsor family paid for his flight. Thus, my dad was able to go to the Bronx. Now I said brother because this looks just like my brother. Here he is, Joe. If you know Joe, I really love this photo because I think they look strikingly similar in this photo. My dad would tell me that this was the first ever mattress that he had slept on in the United States, and many of his furniture had come from the garbage. They moved to the United States with no English, no money, no food, no connections. So where did they have to get their furniture from? It was from the trash. And my father moved to the US when he was in 6th grade. So here's a photo of him at his elementary school graduation. And as I learned the details of my dad's immigration to the Bronx, I could not help but become extremely inspired. Because you have a child who was a street child running around in Saigon with practically no parents as he was abandoned, but eventually make his way up, able to graduate elementary school, got a full-ride scholarship to go to a private high school in the US, and eventually graduate from Columbia University, where's the slide, on a full-ride scholarship on his own merit. So as I really dug deep into my dad's roots, I really gained a greater appreciation for where I am today and what it took for my family to get here right now. And with all of that, I knew I had to preserve everything that I had learned because my grandchildren and their grandchildren will have questions. Everyone has questions about family, and I wanted to make sure that I could preserve my answers to my questions. Which leads me to part 3. What did I discover? After I discovered, what am I going to do with this knowledge? Everything that I've gained, my 300-page archive of all these photos. I think the most important of which is that I'm donating my family archive, all my photos and my recordings to Fulbright University here in Vietnam. Yes, the one by Crescent Mom. It means means a lot to me to know that there will be historians down the road who perhaps will have questions the same way I did, and that my family's sources will be able to help answer those. And it means a lot to me to know that my family's story will be preserved, and that my future generations, my father's future generations, will know our story. In addition to just preserving history, I'm also promoting my story by working with Mr. Fan, who is my senior directed project advisor here at SSIS, to put together a memoir, a written book from the perspective of someone in my family, most likely my dad, who will have really touching narrative experiences of what my family had to go through at this time. And lastly, on a more history angle, I'm also writing a research paper at the same time, which details the overall trends of refugee communities at this time. So with that said, I would really like to thank everyone for being here today. I said yesterday, this is perhaps my first time sharing my family story at the age of 18, quite young, because most people share them later on. But I'm really glad that I was able to do this early and that you all are able to be in this process with me, because I understand this is a lifelong process of uncovering different things about my family, but also creating my own legacy. So this is just the very beginning, and I'm really glad that you were able to share this experience with me. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to move on to Q&A if any of you have any questions. And I'm going to sip my avocado smoothie along the way. But please, if you have any, just let me know. Yes.
What kind of narrative you're trying to present in that?
I'm actually going to a meeting next week to really figure that out 100%. But I'm hoping that my memoir will consist of hopefully a first-person account of all of these experiences from my father, as I have him as a primary source in this story, and mostly detail experiences in Saigon for the first 12 years that he was here, and then later to his early immigration to the United States. So really just like that 20-year period of time.
Okay, like documenting the experience or telling a story,
yeah,
and leaving that in, like, are you thinking?
Yeah, like the relationships between different family members. And I think that's really special for me because there are some family members, like my grandfather, who passed away before, I could remember what he was like. So hopefully through my memoir, I can create that voice for myself and also for other people in my family. Thank you. Thank you for that question.
What do you think is one of the biggest surprises that you discovered in this journey? Or, maybe the second question would be, what underlying assumptions did you have that have been changed by doing this type of research about your family or about Vietnam?
Yeah, okay. My first thought in my head, and my mom is smiling at me because I think she knows what I'm going to say, is that's a bit silly, is my dad is 6'1", so all my life I thought that we got our really tall genes from this really tall white man who was going to carry the bloodline with his 6'4" genes. But I called my Vietnamese grandmother and she told me that he was like 5'2". So that would be my genuine answer to your question, was that I found out my grandfather was short. But I think the most emotional and the most history-focused thing that surprised me was the conditions of Vietnam that my father had to live in during this period. Because I knew that life was tough, but it wasn't really ever talked about. So through my interview with my dad and more history research, I really discovered how rough it was to live. Because my dad would tell me, in order to even, have one bowl of rice, my grandfather would have to go trade gold, hold on to that gold for perhaps a week or two before he was able to get any return. So really just understanding the circumstances that my family was in, I think. Yeah. Question?
Has it opened up your perception of the city that you live in?
Oh, yeah.
How has your perception of different parts of the city changed?
For sure. It has changed a lot, maybe less in the way I look at it, but more of my appreciation, I would think. Because in my secondary sourcing, when I was really contextualizing for myself, I learned about the US Embassy and what they had to go through during this time and all the helicopters flying through. And coincidentally, the same week, I had to go get my passport renewed. So I was standing there waiting for them to x-ray my phone and my AirPods. And, I don't know, I just feel so much more emotional when I'm in different parts, especially in D1 and also in D5. Question?
Good question for you on that.
Whoa. Oh.
I just want to know how proud you are of your daughter.
Oh, extremely proud. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
But I didn't expect my life to be made public.
Thanks, Dad. Apologies, in advance. We're not. Yeah.
Well, since we crossed that Rubicon, is it okay to ask your dad how you feel about this project now?
How do I feel about
How
it?
do you feel about your history being presented to us in the world?
Well, firstly, I don't mind. I guess when I was growing up in the Bronx, I remember I met a German reporter around 8th grade, and he came into the Bronx, wanted to interview Amerasians and get the stories out there. And I remember I turned down the interview. And he kept pursuing me for a long time. So I guess up until 2012, when I started educational charity to give back, did I start sharing my story. Growing up, I felt always, I guess, embarrassed or ashamed. And it's not, something that I share. No one from my high school days or university days know anything about me. So, yeah, this is, for me, something quite private, personal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dad.
I don't know if you said this in the beginning and I missed it, but do you have any ties to your biological American grandfather or your
No.
family at all?
No, I mean, we have information about my biological grandfather, but we've never pursued them or really tried to look for them. We haven't taken a DNA test yet.
You mentioned that both of your parents had a background in Chinese-Vietnamese immigration. Have you considered going back and exploring that route of immigration or?
You mean my mother's route?
Yeah. The
Mhm.
idea of going that route and taking and moving different sort of.
I have. So funny story was 3 weeks my mom and I went on Hong Kong to a little trip to go visit my grandma. And at the time my Guma, who's my father's sister, who's in one of these photos, she lives in Vietnam, in Hong Kong. So I was interviewing her, my mom was there, and my mom and I were very curious because it's really complicated. I'll try and summarize it. My mom's grandmother was a Chinese-Vietnamese as well, who left Vietnam to go to Hong Kong due to financial circumstances. So we were really curious. We're like, are there any ties between my mom's grandmother and my father's grandmother? And we're trying to figure all that out. We made some phone calls and we found out that my mom's grandma was the daughter of a French colonizer-ish kind of figure in Vietnam. So maybe you can correct me, but he essentially came in the 1960s because of the period of French colonialism, mingled with some Vietnamese and some Chinese, had my grandmother. So it is really interesting because I think there are crossovers in timelines between my father and my mother, and I think, yes, after this, I'm very interested in pursuing my mom's line. Thank you. Any other questions? If not, I think we will finish up because I have an econ test and we all need to go. So thank you. Thank you all for being here once more.